Fire. Fire erupts from the east corner of the barn in the dead of night, Dakota Territory 1864. Flames climb the dry hay stores with a hungry roar. A giant silhouette bursts from the house. Bare feet in freezing mud. No thought. Only running.
Come on,
Horses
move! We
scream,
gotta
stall
get out!
doors kicked open.
Yeah,
Two
pull
animals
with
hauled
me!
clear by pure strength, then the milk cow.
Get
Then the
out!
chickens in a storm of
Move, you
feathers.
stubborn beast!
The well is 40 paces away. Bucket after bucket. Smoke thick enough to choke. Skin blistering. But that enormous frame keeps moving. Someone poured coal oil into that corner. On purpose, to drive her out. To turn this place to ash. The fire still burns. And she is still running toward the well. Dakota Territory. 1864. Augusta Redding folded the dish towel one last time. Set it on the rail. Straight. Exact. The way she did everything, because sloppy hands got you noticed, and being noticed had never once gone well for her. Judith Coswell was dead 6 weeks, and her daughter, Priscilla Weatherby, had come down from St. Paul with a mourning veil and a notebook, writing things down, walking room to room, writing more things down. Augusta had seen this before. Not this exact thing, but the shape of it. Priscilla found her in the kitchen, on a gray Tuesday morning, stood in the doorway like the doorway that belonged to her, which it did now, technically, on paper. "We'll be reducing the household," Priscilla said, not looking up from the notebook. Effective the end of the week. Augusta kept her hands still on the counter, because that was the trick. Keep the hands still, keep the shoulders down, keep the whole enormous frame of herself folded small and quiet, so the room could pretend she wasn't taking up the space she was taking up. "I understand," Augusta said. Priscilla looked up then. Really looked. The way people looked at her. Up. Then further up. Then a small flinch they thought they hid. "Mother always said you were a hard worker." A pause. "Given your circumstances." Augusta didn't ask what circumstances. She knew. She'd known since she was 11 years old and had outgrown every other child in the county, then every grown man in it too. 6 feet and 8 inches of her, standing in a doorway, built for someone half her size, and a lifetime of people rearranging their faces when they saw her coming. "I'll be out by Friday," Augusta said. "There's a letter of character, and a month's wages. That's generous, given my circumstances." Augusta finished. Yes. Priscilla's mouth did something that wanted to be a smile and didn't make it. She went back to her notebook. Augusta went back to the towel that was already folded. That was the whole conversation. 20 seconds that ended a year and a half of her life. She had learned by 25 that the endings never took long. It was the middles that dragged. The middles were where you built something. The endings just walked in wearing a mourning veil and told you the building didn't belong to you after all. She packed that night. 2 dresses, both let out at the shoulders herself, because no dressmaker in 3 counties kept fabric wide enough on the bolt. A knife with a bone handle that had been her father's, one of the only things of his she still had. $41 folded into a strip of oilcloth, and a coat that fit her the way a tent fits a single pole. Loose everywhere it should be loose. Tight everywhere it shouldn't. She left before sunrise, because leaving in daylight meant leaving in front of people, and people watching her walk away always did the same thing. They stared at the size of her back, like they were waiting for the ground to shake. It didn't shake. It never had. That was the joke nobody found funny except her, and she didn't find it very funny either. Just familiar, which was its own kind of comfort, she supposed. The comfort of knowing exactly what shape the next insult would take before it arrived. The walk to Larkspur Hollow took the better part of 2 days. She could have ridden, except she'd sold the horse the Coswells let her keep, because a horse ate money, and money was the one thing standing between her and nothing at all. So she walked. Long strides that ate ground the way most women's strides never could. That was one gift her size had given her, at least. Distance meant less to her than it meant to anyone else. Except distance wasn't the problem. The problem was the thinking. 2 days of open sky, and frozen grass, and nothing to do but think. And thinking was where Augusta Redding got into trouble. Because she thought about the letter of character folded in her coat pocket. Hard-working. reliable, of unusual size but capable. Someone had actually written that, of unusual size, as if her body were a footnote to the sentence of her, instead of the sentence itself, which was how most people read her. A footnote, a curiosity, a thing to explain before you got to the part where she was a person, until she stopped thinking about it. Because thinking about it did nothing. It never had. Except the memory came anyway, uninvited, the way memories do when the road is long and empty, and there's nothing left to distract a person from the one they've spent years trying not to look at straight on. She was 16, standing in her mother's kitchen. A man in a good coat had come through the county that spring, the same kind of man she'd meet again, years later on a different road entirely, though she didn't know that yet, couldn't have known it. He'd sat at their table and eaten their bread, and made his pitch smooth and warm, the way men like that always did, about a traveling exhibition and a fair wage, and a chance for a family, with too little money to finally have some. Her mother had listened the whole way through without saying a word, had let him finish his sentence, finish his tea, finish believing he'd won. Then she'd stood up, picked up the rolling pin, still dusted with flour from the morning's bread. And she had not raised it, not exactly, just held it, plain and visible, the way you hold a fact you intend someone to notice. "Get out of my house," she'd said, "and don't you ever let me hear you asking a mother to sell her daughter for looking at twice." The man had gone. Fast, faster than his dignity probably preferred. Augusta had never forgotten her mother's face in that moment. Fierce, unashamed, like the very idea of her daughter behind a curtain, on a platform, priced for looking, was an insult too large to answer with anything less than a rolling pin and a look that meant it. She held on to that memory, now the way she held on to the strap of her bag. Tight. Because some griefs kept you warm even in the cold if you let them. She thought instead about the land notice. Torn from a St. Paul newspaper, soft now at the folds from being carried and unfolded so many times. 160 acres. Larkspur Hollow, Dakota Territory, abandoned near 18 years. Eligible under improvement provisions to any claimant who could work it. 18 years empty, which meant 18 years of no one wanting it badly enough to fight for it, which meant, maybe for once, she'd be first in line instead of last. She held on to that thought the way she held on to the strap of her bag. Tight. Because it was the only thing keeping the cold out. The cold in Dakota Territory in November did not care how big you were. It found the same gaps in a giant's collar that it found in a child's. Augusta walked with her head down and her pace steady, and somewhere around midday, on the second day, snow started in thin and sideways, and she thought about her mother. Her mother had been a small woman, barely 5 feet, quick hands, quicker tongue. Augusta had never understood, growing up, how a woman that small had produced a daughter this large, until her mother told her once, the only time she ever spoke of it plainly, that her own mother, Augusta's grandmother, had been built the same way. Big-boned, big-shouldered, a giant of a woman, the old stories called her, and, not kindly, "It skips a generation," her mother had said, "and then it comes roaring back, like the land deciding to remind everyone what it's capable of." Her mother had said that, like it was a blessing. Augusta had spent 9 years since trying to believe her. Larkspur Hollow came into view on the afternoon of the second day. A cluster of buildings hunched against the cold. Smoke from a dozen chimneys. A church steeple that looked like it had been added as an afterthought and regretted since. The recorder's office sat at the far end of the main street, a narrow building with a shingle out front that had faded past legibility. Augusta stood outside it for a moment, not from fear, from the particular exhaustion of a body that had walked 2 days, and now had to perform steadiness it didn't fully feel. She opened the door. The man behind the counter looked up, thin, spectacles, ink on 2 fingers of his right hand. He looked at her the way men always looked at her, first up and up again, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He went pale. Not surprised pale. Frightened pale. "I'd like to file a claim," Augusta said. "The Marrow property. 160 acres. Out past, I know where it is." The clerk's voice came out tight. He set his pen down like it had gotten too heavy to hold. You're the woman from the Coswell place. Word travels. I am. Word travels about other things, too. He glanced at the door behind her, as if checking whether anyone else had heard. Miss, I don't think that's a claim I can process today. Augusta felt something settle in her chest. Not surprise. She'd expected some version of trouble, just not this particular flavor of it. Why not? There's talk. He said it fast, like getting rid of something hot, about that property, about women of yore, about a person of your particular build taking it on. There's talk it's cursed ground already. That place, 30 years, no one could make it pay. And folks are saying a person your size showing up to claim it. Well, folks say that's an omen, that the land's telling us something, sending someone that don't look natural to work unnatural ground. The room was very quiet. Somewhere behind the clerk, a stove ticked as it cooled. Augusta had been called worse. She had been called worse by better-dressed men in better-lit rooms. But there was something about hearing it dressed up as prophecy, as if her own body were a message from God about a piece of dirt, that made her hands go still on the counter, in the particular way they went still, when she was working very hard not to let her face show anything at all. What's your name? She said. Ambrose Tate. Mr. Tate. She kept her voice level, flat as the counter between them. I am not an omen. I am a person who walked 2 days in the cold to file a claim. I am legally entitled to file. The Homestead Act does not have a clause about the size of the applicant. Does it? Tate said nothing. Does it, Mr. Tate? No, ma'am. Then you have two choices. She leaned forward, just slightly, and watched him register how much of the counter she could reach without moving her feet. You can process my claim the way you'd process anyone's. Or you can explain to your superiors in the territorial office exactly why you refused a lawful application. And you can explain the reason you gave, out loud, to them, in those words. Tate's throat worked. Say the words again, Mr. Tate. For the record, tell me why you won't take my claim. He didn't say them again. He got the ledger, hand shaking, just slightly, and Augusta Redding filed on 160 acres of abandoned Dakota Territory land, while the clerk who'd called her an omen wrote her name in a book with a pen that kept skipping because his fingers wouldn't hold steady. She signed at the bottom. Her signature was large. It had always been large. She'd stopped apologizing for it years ago. There, she said. Was that so difficult? Tate didn't answer that either, which she took, on balance, as a kind of victory. The feed store sat 2 doors down from the General Mercantile, and Augusta went in for grain and rope and a length of new chain, because a claim on paper was worth nothing until it was a claim on the ground, and the ground would need feeding before it fed her back. The man behind the counter was built solid through the shoulders, silver starting at his temples, though he couldn't have been much past 50. He had the kind of face that had learned, a long time ago, exactly how to arrange itself to look friendly, while meaning something else entirely. He watched her come through the door, watched the doorframe, actually watched her duck slightly, the way she always had to, the way that never stopped being a small daily humiliation, even after a lifetime of ducking. Well, he said, loud enough for the 2 other customers to hear. Look what walked in. Augusta kept walking toward the counter. Grain, rope, chain. If you carry it in a heavier gauge than what's on the shelf, you're the one filed on the Marrow place. Not a question. He said it the way a man says something he's already decided to enjoy. Heard about you before I saw you. Didn't believe the half of it. Which half didn't you believe? That caught him for a second. Just a flicker. Then the friendly mean face slid back into place. Folks are saying you're planning to work that ground alone. A small laugh, meant to invite the other customers into it. One of them, an older woman near the flour barrels, didn't laugh. Just watched. The way people watch something they suspect is about to go wrong. That land's beaten 3 grown men with money and mules and hired hands. What exactly do you figure you've got that they didn't? Augusta set her coins on the counter, counted them out loud, slow, so he'd have to wait for it. I've got hands, she said, big ones. And I've got nowhere else I'm expected to be, which is more than most men can say when the work gets hard and they start missing their supper on time. The older woman, near the flour barrels, made a sound that might have been a laugh she was trying to swallow. The man behind the counter's face did something complicated. The mean, friendly mask slipped for just a second, and underneath it Augusta saw not contempt exactly. Something else. Something more careful. Like a man recalculating a sum he'd thought he already knew the answer to. Cyrus Thorne, he said, held out his hand like an afterthought. She looked at the hand, then shook it, and watched him feel, for just a moment, the actual size and strength of the grip he was dealing with. His jaw tightened. He didn't pull away first, but he wanted to. Augusta Redding, she said. Well, Miss Redding. He recovered the friendly voice, but it had a different texture now. Thinner. I own most of the feed and grain that comes through this valley one way or another. You'll be back. I expect I will. Some might say that's good business sense on your part. His eyes did something strange then. Not mocking anymore, not exactly. Measuring. Some might also say that place has a way of finishing people off slow enough that you don't see it coming till it's already done. Is that a warning, Mr. Thorne? Or a threat? The question landed harder than she meant it to. The store went quiet enough that Augusta could hear the stove crackling in the back room. Just an observation, Thorne said finally. Ground's ground. Some of it don't want to be worked. Some of it's got history. Every acre in this territory's got history. Not like that one. He didn't say anything else, just rang up her purchases, with hands that were, Augusta noticed, not quite as steady as they'd been when she walked in. She left the store with her grain and rope and the heavier chain, and she carried something else out with her too, something she couldn't quite name yet. Not fear. She'd stopped being afraid of men like Thorne a long time ago, the same way you stop being afraid of weather once you've walked through enough of it. But there was a note underneath his warning that didn't sit right. Something rehearsed about it. Something that had less to do with her and more to do with the land itself. She filed it away, because she had a farmstead to reach before dark and a lifetime of experience telling her that some things you couldn't solve standing still on a boardwalk, turning them over and over. Some things you only solved by walking toward them. The mercantile was her last stop before dark, and there she met a man named Otis Farr, who ran the place with an apron perpetually dusted in flour, and a manner so mild it seemed almost an apology for existing at all. He didn't stare the way Thorne had. Didn't perform anything. You'll want lamp oil, he said, before she'd even asked. Nights get long out that way, and there's no store between here and the Marrow place worth the ride. Thank you. Don't mention it. He weighed out her purchase with careful, unhurried hands. My wife's cousin homesteaded out past Cedar Bend. Woman alone, same as you're fixing to be. Made it work fine, in the end. Took her people a season to stop talking about it. Took her about a week to stop caring what they said. It was, Augusta thought, walking back out into the cold with her supplies, the first entirely kind thing anyone in Larkspur Hollow had said to her, without wrapping it first in something else. She held on to that, too. Small kindnesses kept you warm, same as grievances did. Sometimes better. Hesper Coyle ran the boarding house at the end of the street, a narrow two-story building that leaned slightly west, the way most things in Larkspur Hollow seemed, as if the whole town had been built into a wind that never quite let up. She opened the door before Augusta knocked, had clearly been watching from the window. A short, wiry woman somewhere past 60, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. You'll be wanting a room, Hesper said. Not a question. For a short while, until the farmhouse is fit to sleep in. Hesper's gaze went up and up. Took the whole measure of her, the way everyone's gaze did, but there was something different in it. Less flinch. More arithmetic. You're the one filed on the Marrow place. Word does travel. Word travels faster than most horses in this town. Hesper stepped back from the door. $2 a week. Meals included if you help in the kitchen mornings. I don't rent to men who drink past supper, and I don't rent to anyone who leaves a mess they don't clean themselves. That's fair. It is. Hesper studied her a moment longer. You're bigger than the stories said. The stories usually undersell it, Augusta said. People are kinder in the telling than they are to my face. Something shifted in Hesper's expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough to its cousin. Come in out of the cold, she said, before you catch something even your size can't shake off. There were two other boarders that first week. An elderly surveyor named Corbin, who kept mostly to himself, and a young school teacher, fresh from Ohio, who could not stop staring at Augusta's hands across the supper table until Hesper cleared her throat once, sharp, and the staring stopped. Augusta didn't mind it, as much as she once had. Staring, at least, was honest. It was the sideways looks, the ones that pretended not to be looking at all, that had always cost her more. She helped in the kitchen each morning as promised, and found, somewhat to her surprise, that Hesper Coyle did not treat the size of her hands as a curiosity requiring comment, only as a fact requiring the larger mixing bowl, which Hesper produced from a back cupboard on the second morning, without being asked. Man who used to board here left it, Hesper said, by way of explanation. Big fellow. Ate like he meant to make up for something. She set the bowl down. Never once had reason to use it till now. It was, Augusta thought, the smallest kind of welcome, and it landed harder than most large ones ever had. Augusta rode out to the Marrow farmstead the next morning, on a horse borrowed from Hesper's brother-in-law for the price of a day's fence mending, and what she found waiting for her was worse than the newspaper notice had prepared her for, and somehow at the very same time, exactly what she'd expected. 18 years does a particular kind of damage to a house. Not the sudden damage of fire or flood, the slow damage, the damage of roofs that give one shingle at a time, of window glass that clouds and cracks from frost, sight through it winter after winter, with no one there to notice. The barn leaned the way Hesper's boarding house leaned, except worse, except like it had given up leaning and started actually falling slowly, one board complaining against another. And behind the barn, sealed shut with tar gone black and hard as iron, stood a smokehouse. She noticed it first, because it was the only structure on the whole property that hadn't decayed. Everything else had surrendered to 18 years of weather. The smokehouse stood exactly as it must have stood the day someone last touched it, door sealed. Iron strapping bolted across the seams, as if someone had wanted it to survive whatever came next, no matter how long next took to arrive. She didn't open it that first day. There was too much else that needed doing, and some instinct in her, the same instinct that had kept her steady through every insult, every doorway too small, every room gone quiet, when she entered it, told her the smokehouse could wait, that whatever was behind that door had already waited 18 years. A few more weeks wouldn't hurt it. So she started with the roof. Because a roof was urgent in a way a sealed door wasn't. Because winter in Dakota Territory did not negotiate, and a woman without a working roof over her head by January was a woman who wouldn't see February. She worked alone for the better part of 2 weeks. Up before light, down after dark, her hands blistering, and then call-ousing, and then slowly remembering the shape of the work from years of doing exactly this kind of labor on land that had never once belonged to her. There was a rhythm to it that she came to recognize as its own kind of prayer. Strip the ruined shingle, set the new one. Drive the nail, 3 strokes, never more, because her father had taught her that a 4th stroke on a nail already seated only weakened the wood around it. Move down the row, start again. She was 9, the first time he'd let her hold the hammer herself up on the roof of a neighbor's barn, her father's hand loose around hers, not guiding so much as simply present, in case the weight of the thing surprised her. It hadn't surprised her. Even then, small as she'd still been at 9, her hands had known what to do with the tool before her mind had caught up to explain it. 3 strokes, he'd said, not 2, not 4, 2 and the nails not seated proper. 4 and you've bruised the wood around it for nothing, weakened what you meant to strengthen. He'd tapped the hammer against his palm, thinking, most men don't have the patience to stop at 3. They keep swinging past the point the job's already done, because swinging feels like progress, even when it isn't. You'll learn to feel the difference. The wood tells you, if you listen. She had asked him once how he'd learned to listen to wood. Same way you learn to listen to anything that doesn't use words, he'd said. You pay closer attention than seems reasonable, for longer than seems necessary, until one day the thing's telling you things that it was saying all along. He had died when she was 14. A fever that took him fast, faster than anyone expected, and left her mother to finish raising a daughter already taller than most grown men in the county, with nothing but his knife and his lessons, and a silence where his voice used to be. Augusta had spent the 11 years since, occasionally forgetting the sound of it, but never the lessons. The lessons had outlasted the voice entirely, the way lessons from the dead sometimes did, arriving in her hands whenever her hands needed them most, long after the man himself had stopped being anything but a shape in her memory and a knife in her coat. 3 strokes, she thought now, driving a nail into a roof that finally, for once, belonged to her, her father's rhythm, still living in her wrists, a decade after his own hands had gone still. She wondered sometimes if that was the truest kind of inheritance there was. Not land, not money, just the particular, specific way a person had once taught you to listen to something, passed down quiet and permanent, long after every louder thing about them had gone. She thought, working, about how much of her life had been spent making other people's roofs sound. The Coswell roof, the roof before that, and the one before that, going back to Chud, spent mending whatever needed mending in exchange for a place to sleep that wasn't quite her own. She had gotten very good, over the years, at making things whole that belonged to someone else. This roof was hers. This blister was hers. This exhaustion, for the first time in 25 years, was earning something that belonged to her and no one else. The night she finished the last row of shingles, she moved her bedroll out of Hesper's boarding house and into the farmhouse itself, sleeping under a roof that no longer let the sky through, for the first time in her life, entirely her own. She lay awake longer than the exhaustion should have allowed, listening to a silence that had a different quality out here than any silence she'd known before. Not empty, not the silence of a room where she'd learned to make herself smaller, just quiet, the ordinary quiet of a house, settling around a person it had decided, tentatively, to hold. Somewhere past midnight, it began to rain, light and steady against the new shingles, and she lay there listening to the sound of her own roof, keeping her dry, and found she was smiling in the dark for no reason she could have explained to anyone who might have asked. She rode into town twice more that first month for supplies, and each time she noticed the same small pattern taking shape. Otis Farr greeted her plainly, no performance in it. Ambrose Tate, passing on the boardwalk, tipped his hat and did not linger to see if she'd tip hers back. And Cyrus Thorne watched from his doorway both times, arms crossed, saying nothing at all, which she came to understand was its own kind of statement, delivered in a language she'd learned to read along, time before she ever set foot in Larkspur Hollow. Elias Grange rode up the lane on a gray morning in her 3rd week, and Augusta heard the horse before she saw it, and turned on the roof to look down at a man sitting easy in his saddle, watching her work with an expression she couldn't immediately read. He didn't look surprised at her size. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men, seeing her for the first time, did something with their face. Grange's face did nothing at all, just watched her, the way he might watch anyone doing work worth watching. "Morning," he called up. "Morning. Heard someone filed on this place." "You heard right." He looked around the yard, the barn half-shored, the chicken coop she'd already rebuilt, the garden plot she'd turned, frozen clumps of earth broken open and waiting for spring. He took it all in slow, the way a man takes in a ledger he's trying to balance in his head. "You've done more in 3 weeks than the last fellow managed in 3 months, he said. "What happened to the last fellow? Left in the night. Didn't say goodbye to anyone." A pause. "Didn't say much of anything from what I heard. Just packed a wagon and went." Augusta came down off the roof, stood in the yard facing him, which put her nearly eye level with him even mounted, and she watched him take that in too, without flinching, without the small performance of surprise most men gave her. "You've got an opinion about why," she said. "I've got a guess, share it." Grange dismounted, stood there, holding the reins, looking at her with an expression she still couldn't quite place. Not pity, not curiosity exactly. Something more like respect held carefully, the way you'd hold something you weren't sure yet you were allowed to keep. "Name's Elias Grange. I run cattle on the range east of here." He extended a hand. "Thought I'd come see who was fool enough or brave enough to take this place on. Wasn't sure which I'd find." Augusta shook his hand. His grip didn't try to prove anything. Didn't flinch from hers either. "Which did you find?" she said. "Haven't decided yet." Something almost like a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Roof looks solid, though. That's a point in the brave column. I appreciate the accounting. West fence is down the whole back line," he said, nodding toward it. "Figured I'd help you string wire this morning. Unless you'd rather I mind my own business." "Depends," Augusta said. "Are you offering because you feel sorry for me, Mr. Grange? Or because you think I need rescuing?" "Neither." He said it plain. No performance in it at all. "Offering because it's cold, and fence work goes faster with two people than one, and I don't particularly enjoy watching a person struggle with something I could help fix in half the time. That's all it is. Don't make it into more than that. And if I said no, then I'd mount back up and ride home and think no less of you for it." He shrugged. "Easy. Some people prefer doing hard things alone. I don't hold that against a person. I've done my share of it." Something in Augusta's chest did an unfamiliar thing. Small. Quick. She didn't have a name ready for it, so she set it aside the way she set most things aside, and picked up her gloves instead. "Well," she said, "let's not waste the daylight arguing about your motives, then." They worked the fence line until noon in something close to silence, and it was, Augusta thought, the first silence, in longer than she could remember, that didn't feel like something she had to fill or explain or apologize for. Just two people working. Just the particular, uncomplicated piece of a task getting done. Somewhere around mid-morning, Grange straightened, wiped his forehead, and studied her a moment longer than the work required. "You favors your left side stringing wire," he said. "Same as I do, old habit. Broke my right wrist young. Healed crooked." "How young?" 12. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask her to, which she noticed and appreciated more than she said. "Well," he said instead, "crooked healed is still healed." It wasn't much of a thing to say, but it settled into her chest anyway, warm and unhurried, the way the best things usually did. When they finished, Grange stood back and looked at the line, taut and straight from post to post. "Good," he said. "Thank you." He looked at her a moment longer than the sentence needed. "You'll do fine here, Miss Redding. You said you hadn't decided." "I've decided now." He mounted his horse and rode off down the lane, and Augusta stood in the cold with her hands raw from wire and felt, for the first time since Priscilla Weatherby had stood in a doorway with a notebook and ended her old life in 20 seconds flat, something that might have been the beginning of a new one. She opened the smokehouse on a morning 3 weeks later. Because the roof was finished. Because the barn was shored. Because the garden plot was turned and ready for spring seed. And there was, finally, nothing left standing between her and the one structure on the property she hadn't touched. The tar resisted at first. Thick, black, hardened by 18 winters into something closer to stone than pitch. She worked the pry bar into the seam and felt it give. Slow, reluctant, like something that had been asked to hold on for a very long time, and had started to believe it would hold forever. Because that was the thing about sealed doors, she thought, working the bar deeper. They didn't know they were supposed to open eventually. They just kept holding, until someone came along and asked them not to anymore. The iron strapping came off next. Bolts rusted solid, and she had to work them slow, back and forth, the way her father had taught her a lifetime ago. You don't force a rusted bolt. You convince it. You work the rust loose a fraction at a time until it finally agrees to give. It gave. She put both hands flat against the door and pushed, and it resisted for one long moment, swollen into its frame by nearly 2 decades of frost and thaw. And then It released all at once, with a sound she felt in her chest more than heard, a deep structural sigh, like something exhaling after holding its breath for 18 years. The smell came first, cedar smoke, old and dry, and underneath it something else, something that had been sealed away from the world so long it had turned into its own private atmosphere, untouched by anything outside that door. Augusta stood in the opening and let her eyes adjust. Cured meat still hung from the rafters, desiccated black shapes. She didn't look at too closely. Stone jars lined shelves that had somehow held true through 18 winters of frost heave and settling, which told her something about whoever had built them. Someone who built things to last. Someone who didn't cut corners, even in a smokehouse, no one but themselves would ever see. And in the corner, beneath a shape covered in oilcloth, gone stiff with age, something waited. She crossed the swept floor, knelt, put her hand on the oilcloth and paused there, the way you pause before opening a letter you already suspect will change something. Not because you don't want to read it, because you want to be fully present for whatever it says. She lifted the cloth, a metal box, a foot long, maybe 8 inches wide, sealed at the lid with wax gone the color of old honey. She carried it out into the yard, sat down in the frozen grass with her back against the smokehouse wall, and worked the wax with her thumb until it cracked and gave. Banknotes, folded tight, old but perfectly preserved by 18 years, in a sealed dry room. Beside them, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth all its own, a handful of gold coins arranged with the same careful precision as everything else in that room. And beneath the money, folded twice, and sealed with a small wax circle of its own, a letter. Augusta set the money aside, picked up the letter, broke the seal with hands that were, she noticed distantly, not quite steady. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the hand of a woman who had learned to write with intention and never once lost the habit of doing it well. The date at the top read June 1846. She read, "To whoever comes next. I don't know your name. I don't know your face. I only know that if you're reading this, you've done what I did. You've stood in front of a piece of ground everyone else walked away from, and you decide to stay anyway. My name was Eleanor Marrow. My husband Silas and I built this place from nothing, the way most people build things in this territory, which is to say with more stubbornness than sense. I am writing this in grief so fresh I can hardly hold the pen steady, and I ask you to forgive whatever it does to the handwriting. Only this past spring, a man came to this valley with a scheme. He forged a prior claim on this land, papers made to look old, made to look filed and legal, though they were neither. He meant to force us off by law what he could not take by asking. Silas found the forgery, proved it, before the federal land office, with evidence I have kept safe since, because I still believe, that a lie this deliberate, this carefully built, would come back around one day looking for its due. He did not live to see it fully finished. The proving of it took the last of his strength, I think, though the doctor called it his heart. I choose to believe it was both. A man can only carry so much weight before something in him decides it has carried enough. I have no children, and no one left to tell this to, but a stranger who hasn't arrived yet, and so I am telling it to you instead, whoever you turn out to be. I never learned what became of the man who tried it, only that his family stayed in this valley, and that shame like that doesn't simply die out. It waits. It passes hand to hand, generation to generation, until someone decides to either bury it for good or pick it back up. I am leaving what I have to whoever needs it. Not because I know you, because I don't need to know what it costs a person to stand alone against ground everyone else has given up on. I hope you were taught kindness somewhere along the way, even if the world was not always kind back. I hope you know that what people see first is rarely the truth of what you're capable of. Whatever you find here, know that someone who stood on this ground before you believed, with everything she had, that you deserved a chance to stand on it too. Do something lasting with it. Make sure it matters. Eleanor Marrow Augusta sat very still in the frozen grass with the letter in both hands, and the cold worked its way up through the ground and into her. and she didn't move to stop it. Because there was something in the words, someone who stood on this ground before you, that reached into a part of her chest she'd kept locked down since she was 11 years old and had first understood, watching a room full of children, go quiet and afraid at the sight of her, that her body would always arrive in a room before she did, that people would decide what she was before they ever learned her name. Eleanor Marrow hadn't known her name either, had written this letter 18 years before Augusta was even standing here to read it. In the same season she buried her husband, with grief still wet on the page. And still, somehow, she had written exactly what Augusta needed, at exactly the moment when she needed it. The way a person leaves a lamp lit for someone they'll never meet, just in case they come home late, just in case they come home at all. She read the letter twice more, before the lights started to go copper at the western ridge, and she thought about the man who had tried to steal this land the same year that letter was written, about shame that didn't die out, that waited, that passed hand to hand. She thought about Cyrus Thorne standing behind his counter, warning her off ground that had, in his own words, a way of finishing people off slow, which was a strange thing for a man to say about land he had no stake in, except maybe he did have a stake in it. Except maybe that was exactly the point. Except she had walked into his store weeks ago as a stranger and walked out with a warning that made no sense unless you already knew something about this ground that the newspaper notice hadn't printed. She folded the letter and pressed it flat against her chest, inside her coat, the way you hold something you intend to carry with you for a long while. "I'll figure out what you're not telling me," she said, out loud, to no one. To the smokehouse. To Eleanor Marrow, 18 years gone from this exact spot of frozen grass. "Whatever it is, I'll find it." The wind moved through the valley, indifferent, the way wind always is. The smokehouse stood open behind her for the first time in 18 years, its long silence finally broken, and somewhere down the lane, though she couldn't have known it yet, Cyrus Thorne was sitting behind his own counter with his own ledger, doing arithmetic of a very different kind. Arithmetic that had started before Augusta Redding was even born, and had been waiting, patient as a sealed door, for someone to finally come along and force it open. She gathered the money, gathered the letter, stood up out of the frozen grass with her enormous shadow stretching long and strange across the yard in the dying light, and looked at the farmhouse she had rebuilt with her own two hands. Hands too big for most doorways, too big for most gloves, too big, her whole life, for most rooms she'd ever stood in. Hands exactly the right size, it turned out, for this. She walked back toward the house, because there was supper to make, and a stove to bank for the night, and a claim to defend that had just become, in the space of one letter, considerably more complicated than 160 acres of frozen dirt. But mostly, she walked back because she had decided something, standing in that yard with Eleanor Marrow's words pressed against her chest, and the decision felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in longer than she could remember. She wasn't leaving. Not for Thorne. Not for whatever his family had buried the year. This letter was sealed away, not for a town full of people who looked at her twice before they ever bothered to learn her name. That night, with the stove banked low, and Eleanor's letter set safe in the drawer of the kitchen table she'd built herself, Augusta took out the other letter, the old one. The letter of character, still folded soft at its creases from the 2 days she'd carried it walking to Larkspur Hollow, still carrying its careful, well-meant sentence about a woman of unusual size, but capable. She read it once more by lamplight, considered keeping it, the way a person keeps a scar as proof of something survived. Then she opened the stove door and fed it to the coals instead. It wasn't spite. She turned that over as the paper caught and curled and went to ash, made sure of the truth of it before she let herself feel satisfied by the act at all. It was simpler than spite. She had spent a year and a half being defined, in ink, by a sentence that put her capability second to her circumstances, as if the two were separate facts requiring separate. She didn't need that sentence anymore. She had a claim with her own name on it now, filed in her own hand, and a smokehouse full of proof that somebody, once, had believed in her, without ever needing the qualifier at all. She watched the last corner of the paper blacken and fall in on itself, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with warmth from the stove. She had walked 2 days through the cold to get here. She had opened a door that had stayed sealed for 18 years, and whatever waited on the other side of whatever came next, she intended to meet it standing exactly as tall as she was, with no apology in it at all. Spring came slow to Larkspur Hollow. Mud first, then green, thin, and stubborn, pushing up through frost-cracked ground like it had somewhere urgent to be. Augusta worked from first light, because the letter in her coat pocket had started to feel less like a keepsake and more like a countdown, though she couldn't have said exactly what it was counting down to. She only knew the feeling, that particular hum under the skin that told her something was coming. The way animals look still before weather. She wasn't wrong. The first sign was a rider on the north road, not Grange. Grange came up the lane, direct, unhurried, a man with nothing to hide about where he was headed. This rider stayed on the road itself, slow, and turned his head toward her fence line every few hundred feet like he was counting fence posts, for a reason that had nothing to do with fence posts. She straightened from the trochee she was hoeing, watched him go, watched him come back an hour later, same pace, same slow turn of the head. "You keep circling," she said, out loud, to no one. "You're going to wear a groove in that road." He didn't circle a third time that day. He circled the next day instead. She learned his name from Hesper Coyle, who learned most things eventually, the way water finds every low place in a field, whether you dug the ditch for it or not. "Jed Hollis," Hesper said, setting a plate down in front of Augusta with more force than the plate strictly required. "Works for Cyrus Thorne. Does the kind of work Thorne doesn't want his own hands on." "What kind of work is that?" "The kind that doesn't have a name until after it's done." Hesper wiped her hands on her apron, looked at Augusta with the particular directness of a woman who'd decided, weeks ago, that, plain speaking, was only a currency worth trading in. "He's been asking after you at the mercantile, asking what you found in that smokehouse." Auguste Forsk stopped halfway to her mouth. "I haven't told a soul what I found in that smokehouse." Then somebody's guessing loud enough that it's starting to sound like knowing. The rumor arrived in full 3 days later, and it arrived the way rumors always arrived in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow. Sideways, through 6 mouths before it reached hers, dressed up in just enough truth to be dangerous. She heard the shape of it from Otis Farr, who clearly did not want to be the one saying it, but felt some obligation to say it anyway, the way people sometimes feel obligated to warn you about weather they can already see coming. "Story going around," Farr said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Says what you found in that smokehouse wasn't Eleanor Marrow's to leave. Says there was a claim on that money from before the Marrows ever settled the ground. Prior ownership. Says whatever's in that box by rights belongs to somebody else." Augusta stood very still, because that was almost exactly the shape of the forgery scheme Eleanor's letter had described. Old, and here it was again, dressed in new clothes, walking through town like it had never died at all. "Who's telling this story?" she said. Farr looked, very deliberately, at a shelf of canned goods that did not require his attention. "Folks say it started at the saloon," he said, 2 nights back. "Folks say Cyrus Thorne's the one telling it." Of course he was, she thanked Farr. Walked out of the mercantile with her jaw set hard enough to ache, and stood on the boardwalk for a long moment, doing the arithmetic Eleanor Marrow's letter had handed her weeks ago. A forged prior claim buried years back, a family shamed by it, a man now standing behind a feed store counter, spinning the exact same lie in reverse, not to steal the land through paper this time, but to poison the well of everyone in town before she could even get her water to it, which meant he wasn't improvising, which meant he'd been planning this since before she ever set foot in Larkspur Hollow, because a man doesn't invent a story that precise on the spot. He inherits it. He's been carrying the shape of it his whole life, waiting for the moment it might finally be useful. The rumor did what rumors do. It moved faster than facts, and it settled in the places facts couldn't reach. She felt it on Sunday, standing at the back of the small clapboard church, because the pews near the front had a way of filling up before she ever got there. The way rooms had always found ways to be a little too full for her whenever she arrived. Two women, near the aisle, glanced back at her, then leaned their heads together, and Augusta didn't need to hear the words to understand the shape of the sentence being passed between them. She felt it again at the mercantile, where a woman she didn't know pulled her basket closer to her body as Augusta passed, the way you'd pull something close from a dog you weren't sure of. She felt it most of all in the silence, not the honest silence of people minding their business. The other kind, the kind that had a weight to it, that followed a person down a street and settled behind their shoulder blades, like a hand that wasn't quite touching you, but wanted you to know it could. She had lived inside that particular silence most of her life. She knew its exact temperature. What she hadn't expected, not really, was how much colder it felt, now that she finally had something worth protecting. "Let them talk," Hesper said over supper that week, when Augusta finally admitted how it sat in her chest. "Talk's cheap because it costs the talker nothing. You just make sure what they're talking about turns out to be wrong, and if talking's enough on its own, if nobody needs it to be true, only convenient." Hesper considered that, wiping down the table with more focus than the table required. "Then you make it inconvenient to keep saying," she said finally. "Same as you'd handle any other kind of weed. You don't argue with it. You starve its roots." She sent for a lawyer the next morning. Hesper's brother-in-law knew a man in Yankton, the territorial capital, 2 days right east, a young attorney named Corwin Blake, who'd made something of a name for himself defending homestead claims against exactly this kind of pressure. Blake arrived 6 days later on a good horse, carrying a leather case that had clearly seen more use than its stitching wanted to admit. He was younger than Augusta expected, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who listened with his whole body instead of just his ears. He read Eleanor Marrow's letter twice before he said a word. "This is remarkable," he said finally, "and dangerous. In equal measure. Dangerous how? Because it names something. A forgery. A family shamed by it. If Thorne's family is the family in question, and if he's the one spreading rumors about prior ownership right now, using nearly the identical lie his own people once tried to use." Blake looked up at her. "That's not coincidence, Miss Redding. That's a man finishing something his father started." Or his grandfather, either way. Blake set the letter down with the care of a man handling something that might still be hot to the touch. "We need to file a provenance claim. Establish on the record, before Thorne files anything of his own, exactly where that money came from and exactly why it's yours by right. We do this today. We do this before his version of events has time to calcify into something people believe simply because they've heard it 3 times. How fast can it be done? If the county recorder cooperates." Blake was already standing. Today. They walked to the recorder's office together, and Augusta found herself curious about the man striding beside her, sharp-eyed and purposeful, clearly good enough at his profession that he could have picked easier cases than a giant woman's disputed claim in a valley most of Yankton had never heard of. "Why homestead claims?" she asked. "Man with your evident skill could make considerably more money doing something else." "Could," Blake agreed. "My father lost a claim once when I was young. Not to forgery, just to a man with more money and better lawyers, who understood the law well enough to bend it and never once broke it outright." He glanced at her. "I watched my mother pack our whole life into a wagon in a single afternoon, and I decided somewhere in the packing of it that I'd rather spend my life on the other side of that particular kind of ruin than let it happen to someone else uncontested, if I could help it." "And can you help it every time?" "No," Blake said plainly. "I've lost cases I believed in more than I've won them, some seasons. But I've never once lost one I didn't fight the whole way through. That much I can promise you, Miss Redding. Whatever else comes of Yankton, Ambrose Tate did cooperate. More than cooperate. He moved with the brisk, overcorrected efficiency of a man trying to make up for something. And Augusta understood, watching him work, that he remembered Exactly what he'd said to her the day she filed her claim, and that the memory had been sitting in him ever since like a stone he couldn't spit out. He pulled the original federal land records, confirmed, in writing, that the Marrow claim traced back to an 1846 filing with no prior claimant of record. He countersigned the provenance document with a hand that, this time, didn't shake at all. For what it's worth, Tate said quietly, as Augusta gathered the papers, I was wrong. About the omen business. I want you to know I know that. Augusta looked at him a long moment. Words are a start, Mr. Tate, she said. Keep going. The province filing bought her something. Not safety. She understood by now that safety wasn't a thing this valley intended to offer her, cheaply. But time. A few weeks of quiet, while the rumor Thorne had planted struggled to take root in ground that now had a legal document standing in its way. She used the quiet to work, because that was the only thing she knew how to do with fear that had nowhere else to go. Turn it into labor. Feed it into the ground. Let the ground take it and give back something useful in return. The south field went in first. Straight rows, careful spacing, seed corn she'd bought with Eleanor's gold and priced out 3 times over before she trusted the arithmetic. Elias Grange came by most mornings now, not always announced, not always needed, but there, working alongside her with the same unhurried steadiness he'd brought to that first fence line. They didn't talk much while they worked. That had become its own kind of language between them, not the silence of two people with nothing to say, but the fuller silence of two people who'd fuller silence of stopped needing to fill every quiet space with noise. You ever think about what you'll do? Grange asked one morning, straightening from a row of seed corn, once this place is running the way you want it. I think about it every night, Augusta said, usually right before I fall asleep too tired to finish the thought. And where does the thought usually land? She considered him. Dirt on his hands, sun already starting to color his face despite the early season, watching her with that same careful, unflinching attention he'd given her from the very first morning. Somewhere, I don't have to duck through doorways, she said. Somewhere the size of me is just a fact about me, not a headline. Grange nodded slowly, didn't laugh, didn't soften it into a joke the way most men might have. Uncomfortable with a truth that plain. Seems like a modest thing to want, he said. Considering. Considering what? Considering most people spend their whole lives wanting things a lot less honest than that. Augusta didn't have an answer ready for that one. She went back to the row instead, and if her chest felt a little tighter than the morning's work should have accounted for, she didn't examine it too closely, because some things, she'd learned, went bad the moment you looked at them straight on. Better to let them sit sideways in your peripheral vision a while longer. Better to let them ripen before you pick them. It became, over the weeks that followed, a habit neither of them named out loud. He would arrive most mornings before the dew had burned fully off the grass, and she would have coffee waiting, whether she'd meant to make enough for 2 or not. And somewhere, in the space between the coffee and the first row of the day's work, they would talk about small things, the particular stubbornness of Dakota soil, a calf born wrong-footed on his range that had, against every expectation, decided to live anyway. The way certain birds returned to certain fields year after year, as if the field itself had made them a promise once and they'd come back expecting it kept. He never once asked her to be smaller in any of it. Never once softened his voice the careful way people did when they were trying not to startle something large. He simply talked to her, the way he'd talk to anyone whose opinion he valued. And she found, somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary mornings, that she had started listening for the sound of his horse on the lane before she'd fully admitted to herself that she was listening for it at all. The man from the traveling show arrived on a Thursday, and Augusta knew what he was before he'd said a single word, because she had met his particular species before, more than once, in more than one town, and the shape of him never changed, even when the face did. He came up the lane in a wagon painted in colors too bright for the mud season, gold lettering across the side that read Thistle's Traveling Museum of Wonders in letters twice the size they needed to be. The man himself climbed down, slow, deliberate, like every movement he made was a performance he was giving to an audience. Only he could see. "Miss Redding," he said, sweeping his hat off with a flourish that belonged nowhere near a working farmstead. "Jasper Thistle, at your service. I don't recall requiring any." "No, no. Of course not." He smiled wide enough to show teeth. "But I heard tell, traveling through this valley, of a woman of truly remarkable stature, and I confess, ma'am, my curiosities simply would not let me pass through without paying my respects." Augusta set down the hoe she'd been leaning on, straightened to her full height, slow and deliberate, and watched him do the thing men did. The up and up again. The small flicker of something behind the eyes that tried to look like admiration, and didn't quite manage it. "Say what you came to say, Mr. Thistle. Direct. I admire that." He stepped closer, and she noticed he stopped himself a half step short of where most men stood. The way you'd stop a half step short of an animal you weren't entirely sure of. "I run an exhibition, Miss Redding, a respectable one. Educated audiences, back east mostly, though we tour the territories in season. Marvels of the natural world. Curiosities that remind folks of the grandness God's capable of. You're asking me to be a curiosity. I'm asking you to be paid handsomely." His voice dropped, warm, coaxing, the voice of a man who'd talked 100 desperate people into 100 bad decisions, and never once doubted his own charm for it. $50 a month. Room and board provided. All you'd need to do is stand, Miss Redding. Simply stand, and let people look, and marvel, the way they're marveling right now whether you like it or not. Something old and cold moved through Augusta's chest, because she remembered this offer, had heard versions of it since she was 16 years old, standing in her mother's kitchen, while a man very much like this one made the exact same pitch to a family too poor to say no on principle alone. She remembered her mother's hand on the rolling pin, steady, unhurried, the flour still dusted white across her knuckles. Remembered the exact words. "Don't you ever let me hear you asking a mother to sell her daughter for looking at twice." She didn't have a rolling pin handy now. She found, standing in her own yard, that she didn't need one. "I have a farm to run, Mr. Thistle," Augusta said, keeping her voice level, though it cost her something to keep it that way. "I don't stand still for money. I work for it. $50 a month is more than most farms turn in a season. Then I'll simply have to make my farm work harder." Thistle's smile flickered, just slightly, the first honest expression she'd seen on him since he climbed down from that wagon. "You understand people are going to look at you regardless," he said, quieter now, and there was something almost gentle underneath the pitch, which somehow made it worse. "That's simply the fact of it, Miss Redding. The looking doesn't stop, because you say no to me. All I'm offering is to make the looking pay." Augusta stepped closer to him. Let him feel, for one long moment, the full undeniable fact of her height, her breadth, the sheer physical presence he'd traveled 2 counties hoping to purchase. "The looking has never once stopped in my whole life," she said. "You're right about that, but I've decided what it costs, and it doesn't cost me my name on a wagon." Thistle held her gaze a moment longer. Then slowly he put his hat back on. "A pity," he said. "Truly." He turned toward his wagon. Paused. "For what it's worth, a man in town gave me your direction. Told me you'd be worth the trip out here. Said you'd likely say yes, given how hard the ground's been on you." Augusta went very still. "What man?" "Ran the feed store, I believe." Didn't catch his name. Thistle climbed up onto his wagon seat, gathered the reins, and looked back at her with something that might, in a kinder man, have passed for regret. "Good day to you, Miss Redding. Should you change your mind, the offer travels with me most of the season." He drove off down the lane, gold letters catching the gray afternoon light, and Augusta stood in her own yard with her hands curled into fists so tight her nails bit into her palms, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, exactly how far Cyrus Thorne was willing to go. Because it wasn't enough for him to spread rumors, wasn't enough to threaten her claim on paper. He had reached out, deliberately, and tried to have her carted off and sold as a spectacle, the same cruelty her mother had once beaten back from a kitchen doorway. with nothing but a rolling pin and a look. He hadn't just insulted her. He had aimed for the exact place he must have guessed, somehow, would hurt the most, which meant he'd been paying closer attention to her than she'd realized, which meant this wasn't only about the land anymore, if it had ever only been about the land at all. She told Grange about it that evening, sitting on the porch steps with the last of the light going soft over the barn roof. He listened without interrupting, the way he listened to most things, and when she finished, his jaw had gone tight in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "I'd like 5 minutes alone with that man," he said quietly. "Which man? Thistle or Thorn? Either would do. You'd get nothing out of it but trouble," Augusta said. "I've learned that much, at least. Men like that don't feel shame the way you'd want them to. You can't hand it to them. They have to grow it themselves, and most of them never do." Grange was quiet a moment. "How'd you learn to say no to him so plain? Standing right there in the yard. Didn't look like it cost you anything, watching from where I'd have been if I'd been here." "It cost me plenty," Augusta said. "I just learned a long time ago not to let it show on the outside. Showing it only ever seemed to feed the ones doing the asking." He reached over, slow, and took her hand, the way he had that night by the barn, though there was no fire this time. Nothing burning, just the ordinary dusk settling gold and quiet over her land. "You don't have to hide it from me," he said. "Whatever it costs you. I'd rather see it plain." Augusta looked at him a long moment. Then, for the first time since she'd stood in her mother's kitchen at 16 years old, she let someone else see exactly what a moment like that had cost her, and found, to her surprise, that the sky didn't fall for it. She didn't sleep well that night, kept turning it over, the coldness of it, the calculation, until sometime past midnight, when a different kind of wrongness pulled her out of the half-sleep she'd finally managed. Smoke, not the clean, banked smell of her own stove cooling for the night. Something sharper, hotter, wrong in a way her body understood before her mind had fully caught up. She was out the door in seconds, barefoot in the mud, and the sight that met her stopped her heart for one full beat before it kicked back into a gallop. The barn, east corner. Flames already climbing the hay stores she'd spent the whole spring building up, moving with the particular hungry roar of something dry and dense catching all at once. She didn't think. She ran. The horses first, two of them purchased with Eleanor's gold, screaming in their stalls, with the particular animal terror that has no words, only sound. She got the stall doors open with hands that didn't feel the heat yet, hauled them clear by their halters, dragged them bodily when they balked, because a horse's fear made no allowance for reason, and neither, in that moment, did she. The milk cow next. The chickens, herded out in a panicked storm of feathers and noise. And then the fire itself. The well sat 40 feet from the barn, and Augusta ran that distance so many times the number stopped mattering. Bucket after bucket, her enormous frame, the frame she'd spent a lifetime apologizing for, folding smaller, explaining away, finally doing exactly what it had always been built to do. Strength with nowhere left to hide it. Strength with a fire in front of it that didn't care how big she was, only that she kept coming. Because that was the thing about a body this size, she thought, hauling water until her arms screamed and her lungs burned raw with smoke. It had never once been a curse out here. Not tonight. Tonight it was the only reason the barn wasn't already gone. She didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because stopping meant the fire won, and she had buried a father and lost a mother and been told no by enough rooms in her life to know, bone deep, that she did not know how to let something win without fighting it to the very last bucket. Sometime past 2 in the morning, the flames finally gave up more than they took. The east corner stood charred and ruined, but the barn stood. She sank down into the mud outside it, soaked through, hands blistered raw, and for the first time all night let herself shake. Elias Grange arrived at a dead gallop not 20 minutes later, off his horse before it had fully stopped, and the look on his face when he saw her sitting there in the mud, soot-streaked, shaking, but whole, was something Augusta would carry with her a long while after. "I smelled it from the north road," he said, dropping to a crouch in front of her. hands hovering, like he wasn't sure yet whether he was allowed to touch her. Are you hurt? No. Augusta. Her name? Not Miss Redding, and something in the way he said it undid a knot in her chest she hadn't known was tied that tight. Are you hurt? No, she said again. Steadier this time. I put it out. Most of it. The barn's standing. He looked at the barn, looked back at her, and something in his face went hard in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not at her, never at her, but at the empty dark beyond the yard, at whoever had done this and ridden off without staying to watch it burn. This didn't start itself, he said. I know. There's no lamp kept in that corner. No reason for a spark to find its way there on its own. I know that, too. He was quiet a moment. Then he reached out, slow, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to, and closed his hand over hers, where it sat blistered and shaking in her lap. You're not doing the next part of this alone, he said. I mean that plain, Augusta. Whatever comes next. She looked at their hands together, his ordinary-sized, hers enormous even now, even exhausted, even shaking, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. All right, she said quietly. Not alone. By mid-morning, word of the fire had traveled, the way word always traveled in Larkspur Hollow, and Augusta found herself surprised, more than once, by who came up the lane and who didn't. Otis Farr arrived with a wagon of salvage lumber before she'd even finished her first cup of coffee, waving off her thanks with the same mild manner he brought to everything. A woman named Sarah Pruett, wife to the sheriff, though Augusta hadn't met her yet, came with a basket of bread and eggs, and stayed an hour helping scrub soot from the milk pail without once asking a single question about how the fire had started. And Ambrose Tate, of all people, rode out on his lunch hour with nothing but his own tusses, and an offer to help however they were needed. Augusta hadn't expected from a man who'd once called her an omen, and clearly hadn't expected to be making it himself, either. There were others who stayed away. She noticed that, too. A few faces from church who'd whispered behind their hands the week before found urgent business elsewhere that morning. She didn't hold it against them. Not exactly. Fear made people small in all sorts of directions, and she understood small better than most. But the ones who came, she held on to that, filed it away next to Otis Farr's lamp oil and Hesper's borrowed mixing bowl, in the growing ledger she was keeping, without quite meaning to, of every kindness this valley had offered her despite every reason it might have found not to. Grange stayed 3 days straight, working the burned corner of the barn back into something sound, and Augusta found herself, more than once, simply watching him work before she remembered she had her own share of the labor to do. You don't have to stay, she told him, the second evening, when the light had gone long and neither of them had mentioned supper yet. You've got your own range to see to. I know I don't have to. He set a board in place, tested it with his weight before he reached for the next nail. Doesn't change what I'm doing. Elias. Augusta. He said her name the way he'd said it that first night in the mud. Plain, unhurried, like a fact he had no interest in dressing up. I'm not counting the hours I spend here against some ledger I intend to collect on later, if that's what you're asking. I wasn't asking that. What were you asking then? She considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. I suppose I was asking whether you'd tell me if it ever did feel like too much. The staying, the showing up, morning after morning, for a woman who came with considerably more trouble attached to her than most. Grange set down his hammer, looked at her fully, the particular unhurried attention she'd come to trust more than almost anything else in her life. I'd tell you, he said. I've never once been a man who stayed somewhere out of obligation he didn't feel. If I'm here, it's because there's nowhere I'd rather be standing. That's the whole of it. No ledger underneath it, waiting to be balanced. She didn't have a ready answer for that, either. So she picked up the next board instead, and they worked the rest of the light in the same easy quiet that had become, over the months, its own kind of conversation. And if her chest felt full in a way that had nothing to do with smoke or exhaustion, she let it be full, for once, without examining exactly why. Sheriff Silas Pruitt arrived at first light, a lean, sun-weathered man in his 50s who'd worn the badge in Larkspur Hollow, long enough to have stopped being surprised by most of what the valley produced. He walked the burn site with slow, careful attention, crouched at the edge of the charred hay, touched the ground and studied what came away on his fingers. "Coal oil," he said, standing. "Somebody wanted this to catch fast, and catch complete." "Can you prove who?" Grange asked. "Give me time." Pruitt's jaw was tight. "I've had my eye on a certain kind of trouble in this valley a good while now. This isn't the first fire that's found its way onto land somebody else wanted." Augusta felt her pulse pick up. Whose land? Renner Place, 3 years back. Farrow Place, year after that. Pruitt looked at her steadily. Both families sold out within the season. Both fires, at the time, got called accidents. And now I've got a woman still standing after a fire meant to break her. Something almost like respect moved through his expression. That changes the arithmetic sum. It took 4 days for Pruitt to find what he needed. A boot print in the softened mud behind the barn that matched once he'd gone looking. A horse stabled at the livery under the name of Jed Hollis. A clerk at the mercantile, who remembered selling Hollis a full can of coal oil the very afternoon for the more than any lamp in town could reasonably account for. Pruitt brought Hollis in on a gray Tuesday morning, and word of the arrest moved through Larkspur Hollow faster than the itself had moved through her barn. Augusta was there when Hollis broke. Not in the cell itself. Pruitt wouldn't allow that, but in the front office, close enough to hear through the thin wall, close enough to hear a frightened man's voice finally give up whatever he'd been paid to carry silently. "Thorne told me where, told me when." Hollis's voice cracked on the words. "Said it needed to look like an accident. Said a pause, ragged. Said he didn't care if it drove her off the land or drove her clean out of the territory, so long as she was gone by summer." "Why?" Pruitt's voice, low and even. "What's Thorne's stake in one woman's farmstead?" A long silence. Then, quieter. "Said his grandfather nearly had that land once. Said a man named Marrow ruined him over it. Called him a forger in front of the whole land office, back before I was even born. Said the Thorne name never recovered from it. Said getting that land back was the only way to put it right. Said it didn't matter what it cost, or who it cost it to." Augusta stood very still on the other side of that thin wall, and felt years of buried history finally surface whole, exactly the way Eleanor Marrow must have known. Someday, it eventually would. Not a stranger's grudge, a family's shame, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, until it landed, inevitable as weather, on a woman who'd never asked to inherit anyone's unfinished business at all. Word of Hollis's confession reached Percival Duke, the county's land assessor, before Augusta did. She found him at his small office on the edge of town 2 days later, called there by Corwin Blake to review again the improvement documentation on her claim. Documentation Duke had been, until now, strangely reluctant to certify. He was a thin, nervous man, somewhere past 50, with ink-stained fingers and the particular pallor of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. He wouldn't quite meet her eyes when she came in. "Mr. Duke," Blake said, setting the folder on the desk between them. "We've been over this documentation 3 times now. Fence lines, drainage work, roof repair, all witnessed and dated. I'd like to understand what, specifically, continues to trouble you." Duke's hands, Augusta noticed, would not stay still on the desk. "There are questions," he said, "about whether the pace of improvement is consistent with what?" Augusta said. "With one woman working it." "Say it plain, Mr. Duke. I've heard every version of that sentence there is." Duke flinched, and in the flinch, something in his careful composure cracked just slightly, enough for Augusta to see. Underneath it, not contempt at all, fear. "Mr. Duke," she said, softer now, "who's asking you to find fault with my claim?" He didn't answer. His eyes went, for one unguarded second, to the window, toward the direction of the feed store, 2 streets over, and that was answer enough. "He holds a marker on you," Blake said quietly. It wasn't a question either. A debt. Gambling, most likely. given how these things usually run in a town this size. Duke's silence confirmed it more completely than words could have. Mr. Duke Augusta leaned forward, and though her voice stayed gentle, there was nothing gentle left in what she said next. I know what it is to have someone else's power sitting on your chest so heavy you can't draw a full breath. I have lived my whole life under exactly that kind of weight, just a different shape of it. I am not going to threaten you. I am not going to become one more person pressing down. Duke looked up at her then, really looked, for the first time since she'd walked in. But I need you to know, she said, that the claim you're being pressured to doubt is true. Every board, every fence post, every furrow in that south field, I laid it myself, or laid it with help freely given. You can find fault with me for 100 reasons, Mr. Duke. My size, my manner, the fact that I don't apologize for taking up the room I take up, but you cannot honestly find fault with the work. The work is real. The office was very quiet. I know it's real, Duke said finally, barely above a whisper. I've seen it myself. Then someday, Augusta said, standing, you're going to have to decide whether the debt you're carrying is heavier than the truth you're sitting on. She left him there with the folder still open on the desk, and Corwin Blake fell into step beside her on the boardwalk outside. Quiet a long moment before he spoke. That was either exactly the right thing to say, he said, or a considerable risk. Sometimes those are the same thing, Augusta said. Duke did not sleep the night after that conversation, though of course Augusta had no way of knowing it. He sat at his own kitchen table with a ledger of his own, a much smaller and much more private one, and did the arithmetic he'd been avoiding for the better part of a year. He thought about the woman's hands, steady on the desk, and the plain way she'd told him she wasn't going to threaten him when threatening him would have been easier for both of them, would have given him a villain to resent instead of a truth to sit with. He thought about his daughter, asleep down the hall, and what kind of a father he wanted to have been by the time she was old enough to ask him plainly what he'd done with the power he'd been given. He did not decide anything that night, but something in him had shifted, the way ground shifts before it finally gives way, quiet and total, all at once, all at once. What Augusta didn't tell Blake, what she barely admitted to herself, was the smaller thing she did 3 days later. A quiet word to Elias Grange, a portion of Eleanor's gold set aside, and an anonymous payment made through a Yankton bank toward a debt owed by one Percival Duke to a man who was never named on the paperwork at all. She didn't do it to buy Duke's testimony. She was careful with herself about that distinction, turned it over more than once in the dark, making sure the truth of her own motives held up under her own scrutiny before she let herself act on it. She did it because she knew, better than most people in that valley ever would, what it cost to stand in a room while someone else decided what you were worth. And she had the means, for once in her life, to lift that weight off one more person's chest, even a small portion of it, even anonymously, even if it never came back around to help her at all. If it changed anything later, she told herself, that would be Duke's decision to make, not a debt she was owed, a door she was simply choosing to leave unlocked. The summer moved fast after that, faster than Augusta had time to properly feel it moving. The south field came up green and strong, better than she'd dared hope for a first season on ground gone fallow 18 years. Grange was at the farmstead most days now, and the two of them had settled into something that didn't have an easy name yet, though Hesper Coyle, watching them from her boarding house porch whenever Augusta came into town, had started calling it exactly what it was, with a knowing look that made Augusta's ears go hot every single time. There were evenings, that summer, when the work was done and the light was long and gold, and Grange would simply stay a while longer than the work required, sitting on the porch, step beside her, saying very little, needing to say very little. Augusta found she stopped counting those evenings the way she counted most things, stopped measuring them for what they cost her or what they might cost her later. They simply were, in a way very few things in her life had ever simply been allowed to be. Thorne, for his part, went quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that Augusta, by now, had learned not to trust. She was proven right on a warm evening in late July, when a rider came up the lane, at a pace that had nothing casual in it, and Augusta stepped out onto the porch to find Corwin Blake, dust-covered from a hard ride from Yankton, his face carrying news before he'd said a single word of it. "Thorns filed," he said, dismounting fast. "A formal challenge to your claim. Prior interest in the water rights along the creek boundary. Going back, he claims, to an agreement his family made with the original survey, decades before the Marrows ever settled here." "That's a lie," Augusta said. "It may well be. But it's a lie dressed up in enough legal language that a judge is going to have to hear it properly argued before he can throw it out." Blake's jaw was tight. The hearing set for the territorial court in Yankton, 6 weeks from now. Augusta felt the ground shift under her, the way it hadn't shifted since the night the barn burned. And if he wins, the water rights attached to your claim get suspended pending further review. Without water, you can't irrigate. Without irrigation, the South Field doesn't produce at the scale you need to satisfy the improvement threshold at your final assessment. Blake met her eyes, steady, though there was real worry underneath the steadiness. "He's not trying to beat you outright anymore, Augusta. He's trying to starve the claim slow enough that you give it up yourself." Augusta stood on her own porch, looking out at the South Field she had turned with her own hands, the barn she had saved with her own back, the letter still folded against her chest, most days like a second heartbeat. Behind her, she heard Grange's step on the porch boards, felt him come to stand beside her without a word, the way he always did, not crowding her, not rescuing her, just present, the way you'd stand beside a fence line you intended to hold, no matter which direction the weather came from. 6 weeks, Augusta said quietly. 6 weeks, Blake confirmed. "Then we have 6 weeks to prove. Eleanor Marrow was telling the truth," Augusta said, "and that Cyrus Thorne has been lying about this ground since before I was even born." She turned finally and looked at both men, the lawyer who'd ridden hard to bring her the worst news he had, and the rancher who hadn't once, in all these months, flinched from the full size and weight of who she actually was. "Yankton, then," she said. "Let's go finish what his family started, and never had the courage to finish honestly." Behind her, the summer light was going gold over the South Field, and somewhere across the valley, in a feed store on the edge of town, Cyrus Thorne was doing arithmetic of his own, certain, in the particular blindness of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything, that the woman he'd tried to burn out, starve out, and shame out of Larkspur Hollow would finally, this time, simply disappear the way every other obstacle in his life eventually had. He was wrong, and in 6 weeks in a courtroom 2 days' ride east, he was going to learn exactly how wrong, in front of every person in the territory who had ever doubted her. Yankton sat 2 days east by wagon, and Augusta spent both of them the way she'd spent every hard stretch of her life, working the problem in her head until the working wore a groove in it smooth enough to walk, because there was no version of this she hadn't already imagined. Losing, winning, losing in a way that looked like winning until the paperwork caught up with her a season later. She turned each one over, examined it, set it down, picked up the next, until Elias Grange, driving the wagon beside her, finally reached over and put his hand flat over both of hers, where they sat knotted together in her lap. "You're doing the thing again," he said. "What thing?" "The thing where you go quiet and your hands go tight and I can practically hear the gears turning behind your eyes." A pause. "You'll wear yourself down to nothing before we even reach the courthouse. Somebody has to think it through. Somebody already has." Repeatedly, for 2 days straight. His thumb moved, once, across her knuckles. "Let it rest a while, Augusta. It'll still be there when you pick it back up." She looked at him, at the steady, unhurried certainty in his face, the same certainty that had walked up her lane that first gray morning, and never once wavered since. "You make it sound simple," she said. "Most things are, underneath. People just prefer to make them complicated. Gives them something to hide behind." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since Yankton first appeared on the horizon. "What are you hiding behind, Elias Grange?" Something shifted in his expression. Careful, deliberate, The way he did most things. Nothing anymore, he said. Figured that out. Somewhere around the third fence line we strung together. Augusta didn't have a ready answer for that. So she turned her hand over under his and let their fingers lace together there over the reins, and the wagon rolled on toward Yankton in a silence that felt, for the first time in 2 days, like rest instead of dread. Corwin Blake met them at the edge of town, dust already thick on his coat, from riding the circuit of witnesses he'd been gathering for the better part of a week. "Sheriff Pruitt's here," he said, walking beside the wagon as it slowed. "Hollis's confession is entered into evidence, sworn and witnessed. We've also got 2 families willing to speak, the Renners off the North Range and the Farrows, whose place burned the season before yours. Both lost their land to Thorne under circumstances that look considerably less like accident. Once you line them up side by side." "And Duke," Augusta said. Blake's jaw tightened slightly. "Thorne's called him as a witness for his own side. Wants Duke to testify the improvement work on your claim doesn't meet the required threshold. After everything, Thorne doesn't know what you did for him," Blake said. "The debt. He doesn't know you're the reason it's partly paid down. As far as Thorne's concerned, Duke's still exactly as owned as he was in the spring." Augusta felt something cold settle low in her stomach. Because a debt half paid wasn't a debt canceled. Because fear, once it's had months to settle into a man's bones, doesn't always leave just because someone quietly lifted part of the weight off his chest. "Then we'll find out on the stand which way he breaks," she said. "Same as everyone else in this territory eventually does." The Yankton Courthouse was a squat brick building that had been built, Augusta thought, with the specific intention of looking more permanent than the territory around it actually was. Inside, the courtroom smelled of fresh-cut pine and old paper, and it was fuller than she'd expected for a claim dispute out of a valley most of Yankton had probably never heard of before this week. She understood why, walking in. Word had traveled ahead of her, the way it always did. Not just about the claim, about her, the size of her, the story of the fire she'd fought alone with her bare hands and a well 40 feet from a burning barn. She felt every eye in the room find her the moment she came through the door, and she made herself walk the whole aisle without ducking her shoulders, without folding herself smaller, if on one of the old apologies her body had spent a lifetime learning to perform. Because she was done performing smallness for rooms that had never once earned it. Cyrus Thorne sat at the respondent's table with a lawyer from Denver, a smooth, unbothered man named Harwell who had the particular manner of someone accustomed to problems dissolving simply because he'd been hired to make them dissolve. Thorne himself looked thinner, Augusta remembered, tighter around the eyes. A man, she thought, who had been carrying something heavy for so long he'd forgotten it was possible to set it down. Judge Nathaniel Ormsby entered at 9 o'clock, exactly. A compact man in his 60s with the compressed, unhurried energy of someone who had long since run out of patience for wasted time. "This court will hear the matter of water rights and land claim challenge. Thorne versus Redding," he said, seating himself.
"I've read the preliminary filings."
"Extensive on Miss Redding's side, considerably thinner on yours, Mr. Harwell." He looked up. "Let's proceed." Augusta testified first, because Blake had told her, on the ride in, that a plain account, delivered without flourish, would carry more weight in this room than any performance ever could, and she had spent her whole life being told, one way or another, exactly how much room she was allowed to take up. For once, she intended to take up all of it. She told the court about the claim, about Ambrose Tate's initial refusal, and the reason behind it, about opening the smokehouse, about Eleanor Marrow's letter, entered now as evidence, its careful handwriting laid open for a room full of strangers to read. She told them about the fire, about Jed Hollis's confession, about the coal oil, about the boot prints in the mud. She did not raise her voice once, did not reach for anger or grief, though both sat close under the surface of every sentence. She simply told it the way it had happened, in order, and let the plainness of it do the work drama might have undercut. When she finished, Judge Ormsby sat quiet a long moment, looking at Eleanor Marrow's letters still open on the bench in front of him. This woman left this for whoever came next, he said. Not quite a question. Yes, Your Honor. Without knowing your name, your face, anything about you at all. No, Your Honor. She only knew what it cost to stand alone on ground everyone else has given up on. Something moved across the judge's face. Controlled, but not entirely hidden. Continue, Mr. Blake, he said. Tom Renner took the stand next, a broad, weathered man in his 50s who was not accustomed to courtrooms and made no effort to pretend otherwise. He held his hat in both hands the entire time he spoke, turning it slowly by the brim, the way a nervous man works a rosary. Thorne came to me first about a water-sharing agreement, Renner said. Friendly enough about it, at the start. Then my hayfield burned. Then my well went bad, though there wasn't a natural reason for it that I ever found. Then Thorne came back around with an offer that wasn't friendly anymore, just plain and low, and backed up with a look that told me what happened to the hayfield could happen to the house next. And you sold, Blake said. I sold. Renner's jaw tightened. Had a wife and no lawyer and nowhere else in this territory to turn. Told myself for 3 years it was bad luck. Didn't let myself think too hard on the alternative. Because the alternative meant admitting a man could do that to another man and walk around town afterward, like nothing had happened at all. Why testify now? Renner looked, for the first time, directly at Augusta. Because she didn't sell, he said simply. Woman shows me you don't have to. Man like Thorne only wins if everyone before him keeps quiet about how he won it. Grace Farrow spoke next, a soft-voiced widow who had lost her husband the same season she'd lost her land, though she was careful, on the stand, to keep the two griefs separate, as if she'd learned somewhere along the way that letting them blur together only made both harder to survive. My husband didn't believe it was Thorne at first, she said. Wanted to believe it was simply misfortune. Easier to grieve misfortune than to grieve a wrong done to you on purpose by a man you'd shaken hands with in church. She paused. I believed it from the start. I just didn't have the strength left, after burying him, to fight a man with Thorne's money and Thorne's friends in this valley. And now, Blake said gently. Now I have a little more strength than I did, Grace said. Borrowed some of it, I think, from watching a woman twice my size refuse to let the same thing happen to her that happened to me. Judge Ormsby's expression, listening to both of them, had gone flat and hard, in a way that told Augusta, better than any legal argument could have, exactly which direction this case was leaning. Harwell's defense of Thorne rested on 3 legs, and Augusta listened to all 3 the way she listened to weather coming in, watching for where it would break first. The first leg was simple denial. Thorne had no knowledge of Hollis's actions, Harwell argued, and Hollis's confession was the self-interested fabrication of a frightened man trying to lighten his own sentence. Harwell tried to extend the same argument to Renner and Farrow, suggesting misfortune, coincidence, the ordinary hardships of frontier life. Judge Ormsby's expression during this portion suggested he was exercising considerable restraint. The second leg was Duke. Percival Duke took the stand looking like a man, walking towards something he'd been dreading for months. His hands trembled faintly on the rail. He would not, at first, meet Augusta's eyes. Mr. Duke, Harwell said, smooth and confident, in your professional assessment as county land assessor, does the improvement work on the Redding claim meet the required threshold under territorial homestead provisions? The courtroom went quiet. Augusta kept her hands still in her lap, the way she had 1,000 times before in 1,000 rooms holding power over her circumstances, and let her composure carry the weight her voice couldn't from this side of the room. Duke opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No, he said, and the word came out strangled, wrong, and Harwell's expression flickered with the first hint of surprise. No, I mean, that's not... Duke's hands gripped the rail hard enough to whiten his knuckles. I was going to say yes, it does not meet the threshold. That's what I came here prepared to say. Mr. Duke, Judge Ormsby said, leaning forward slightly, are you unwell? I am unwell, Your Honor. I have been unwell since spring. Duke's voice cracked, and something in him seemed to give way all at once, the way a dam gives, not gradually, but entirely, in a single collapsing moment. The improvement work on Miss Redding's claim is exemplary. It exceeds the threshold in every category I have inspected. I have known this since my first visit to the property. I have been paid. No, not paid. His eyes found Thorne's briefly, and something passed between them that looked, to Augusta, very much like a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried too long. I have been threatened by Mr. Thorne over a debt I owe him. He told me plainly that my testimony today would need to favor his claim, or the debt would be called in full, immediately, in a manner that would ruin my family. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Judge Ormsby struck his gavel once hard. Continue, Mr. Duke. Someone paid down a portion of that debt this summer, anonymously. Duke's voice was steadier now, though tears stood plain in his eyes. I don't know who. I have my suspicions. His gaze found Augusta's, and held it. Whoever it was showed me more mercy than I had any right to expect, from a stranger with every reason to want something from me in return. And they asked for nothing. Which is, I have come to understand these past months, a rarer thing in this world than I ever gave it credit for being. He turned back to the judge. The claim is sound. Your Honor, I will not lie about it again. Not for Mr. Thorne, not for anyone. Augusta sat very still, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since the day she'd first walked into that recorder's office and had a frightened man call her an omen, because sometimes, she thought, mercy given quietly, expecting nothing, came back around anyway. Not because you'd bought it, because you'd simply left a door unlocked and trusted someone else to walk through it in their own time. The third leg of Harwell's argument was the water rights claim itself, the prior interest Thorne alleged his family had held since the original survey, decades before the Marrows ever settled the ground. This was where Blake had told Augusta the real fight would happen. Not in confession or blackmail, but in paper, in the dry, patient work of proving a lie old enough to have grown roots. Blake stood, and Augusta watched him lay it out with the same surgical precision he'd shown from the very first day he'd read Eleanor's letter at her kitchen table. Your Honor, I direct the court's attention to Federal Land Office records, dated 1846. He produced a bound file, worn at the edges, and set it before the judge. These are the original survey documents for the Marrow claim, filed by Silas Marrow the same year he uncovered and formally reported a fraudulent prior claim filing attempted against his land. That fraudulent filing, Your Honor, was submitted under the name Bartholomew Thorne. The courtroom went very still. Cyrus Thorne's face had gone the color of old ash. Bartholomew Thorne, Blake continued, grandfather of the respondent, attempted to establish a false prior claim on the same acreage, now in dispute, using forged survey papers dated to appear decades older than they actually were. Silas Marrow proved the forgery before the Federal Land Office of the time. The record of that proceeding, including Bartholomew Thorne's formal censure and the revocation of his standing to file further federal land claims, has remained in the public record ever since, filed and preserved exactly where any member of the public was free to find it, had they thought to look. Harwell was on his feet. Your Honor, this is— Sit down, Mr. Harwell. Judge Ormsby's voice cut clean through the room. He was reading the file himself now, slowly, his expression hardening with every page. This is a matter of public record, going back 18 years, and it appears the respondent's claim to prior water rights rests on precisely the same fraudulent foundation his grandfather attempted to establish on this exact ground, in this exact manner, nearly 2 decades ago. He looked up, found Thorne directly. Mr. Thorne, did you know this history when you filed your claim? The silence stretched long enough that Augusta could hear her own pulse in her ears. Yes, Thorne said finally, barely audible. I knew. The courtroom did not erupt this time. It went quiet instead, the particular hush of a room realizing, all at once, the true shape of the thing it had gathered to hear. Augusta watched Cyrus Thorne sit at that table with his shoulders finally, visibly, giving up whatever they'd been holding up for years, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel toward him at all. Not triumph, something closer to recognition, because she knew, better than most people in that room, what it cost to carry a thing you hadn't chosen, a body, a name, a history, into every room you ever walked into, and to have that thing decide, before you'd said a single word, what people believed you capable of. Thorne had spent his whole life carrying his grandfather's shame, the way she had spent hers carrying stranger stares. The difference, the only difference that mattered, in the end, was what each of them had chosen to do with the weight. She had built something. He had tried to burn something down. That was the whole of it. That was the only verdict that mattered, whatever the judge decided to write down. Judge Ormsby delivered his ruling before the afternoon recess, standing at the bench with the compressed finality of a man who had made his decision and intended to speak it plainly. The water rights claim filed by Cyrus Thorne is denied in full. Founded as it is on a fraudulent premise, this court finds both historically documented and knowingly asserted. He looked at Thorne without any particular heat in it, which somehow landed harder than anger would have. The improvement claim of Augusta Redding on the Marrow property stands confirmed, water rights included, effective immediately. He turned a page. As to the matter of arson, conspiracy, and witness intimidation, those charges will proceed under separate criminal proceeding, based on the sworn testimony entered today, and I expect the territorial prosecutor to pursue them fully. He set the file down, looked, for a long moment, at Eleanor Marrow's letter still resting on the bench beside it. I have read a great many claims in this courtroom, he said, quieter now, less official, the voice of a man setting the gavel down inside himself before he ever reached for it in his hand. Very few of them have arrived with a letter like this one attached. I want it on the record that this court finds it instructive that a woman 18 years gone from this world could have something behind precise enough to still be doing justice today. He looked at Augusta directly. You did something remarkable with what she left you, Miss Redding. I want you to know this court sees that plainly. He struck the gavel once. Court is adjourned. The room came apart into noise the moment the gavel fell. The ordinary chaos of a courtroom releasing everything it had been holding still. Augusta sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her and let herself breathe, fully, for what felt like the first time in 6 weeks. Elias Grange appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't seen him move. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying yet, and he seemed to understand that better than anyone she'd ever known. Across the room, Cyrus Thorne sat alone at his table, Harwell already gathering papers with the detachment of a man who'd been paid for his time and intended to collect the rest of it before riding back to Denver. No one moved to comfort Thorne. No one moved to gloat over him either. He simply sat there. Small in a way Augusta had never once seen him looked before. A man finally set down under the exact weight he'd spent his whole life trying to hand to someone else. She found herself walking toward him before she'd fully decided to. Mr. Thorne. He looked up. Whatever he expected her to say, it clearly wasn't gentle, and the wariness in his face made that plain. Your grandfather's shame wasn't yours to carry alone, she said. But you chose to pick it up anyway, and you chose what to do with it. That part was yours. Only yours. Come to enjoy the view, Miss Redding? His voice had none of its old smoothness left in it. Just exhaustion. No, she held his gaze, steady, the way she'd learned to hold every difficult gaze in her life. I came to tell you, I'll be asking the prosecutor to consider leniency on the arson charge, provided you return the Renner and Farrow. Claims you took by the same methods you tried on me. Full restoration. Their land, their water, whatever's left of what you cost them. Thorne stared at her like she'd spoken in a language he didn't recognize. Why? He said, finally, after everything. Because burning something down never once put anything right, Mr. Thorne. Not your grandfather's shame. Not mine. I'd rather spend what's left of my life building something than spend it making sure you finish sinking. She paused. That's the offer. Take it or don't. But it won't be sitting open forever. She walked away before he could answer, and didn't look back to see what his face did with it. Some things, she thought, a person had to decide on their own, in their own time, the same way Percival Duke had finally decided, alone on that witness stand, what kind of man he still wanted to be. The ride back to Larkspur Hollow felt shorter than the ride out, the way hard roads sometimes do once the worst of the weather's already passed through. Hesper Coyle was on the boarding house porch when the wagon came down the main street, and she was on her feet and moving, and before Augusta had even climbed down. "Well," Hesper said, arms crossed, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "Don't leave an old woman standing here guessing." "Water rights confirmed," Augusta said. "Claim stands. Thorns facing charges." Hesper let out a breath that seemed to carry the whole spring and summer out of her at once. "Good," she said, voice rough. "Good." She looked past Augusta at Grange, still sitting the wagon seat, and something knowing crossed her face. "And what else happened out there in Yankton that you're not saying plain?" Augusta felt her ears go hot. "Nothing else happened." Hesper's eyebrow climbed. "That man's been looking at you the whole ride down that street, like you're the only thing worth looking at in this entire territory, and you're going to stand there and tell me nothing happened." Grange, to his credit, didn't deny it. Just climbed down from the wagon with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, and came to stand beside Augusta on the boardwalk, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Something's about to happen, maybe," he said, "if the lady's willing." Augusta looked at him, at the steady, patient certainty that had never once wavered, not through fire, not through a courtroom, not through 6 weeks of a fight that could have gone very differently. "Ask me proper, Elias Grange," she said. "Or don't ask me at all." Something warm broke across his face, not quite a smile. Something bigger than that. Augusta Redding. He took her hand, right there on the boardwalk, in front of Hesper Coyle and half the street who'd stopped to watch. "I've strung fence with you, fought fire alongside you, and ridden 2 days east and back, just to sit near enough to hear you think. I'd like to keep doing all of it, every season, for as long as you'll let me. Marry me." Augusta stood there, 6 feet and 8 inches of her, in the middle of the street she'd once walked into as a stranger, nobody wanted to claim, and felt the whole weight of every doorway she'd ever ducked through, every room that had gone quiet at the sight of her, every warning about ground too cursed for someone her size to work, felt all of it, finally fall away like something she'd simply outgrown. "Yes," she said. Every season. Hesper Coyle, watching from the porch, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and didn't bother hiding either one. The wedding was small, late September, under the 2 oldest apple trees on the Marrow property, the same trees Eleanor had likely planted with her own hands, decades before either Augusta or Grange had been born. There was no preacher available on such short notice, willing to ride the distance. So a circuit judge passing through on his way to Yankton agreed to perform it instead, and stood beneath the apple boughs, looking faintly bewildered by the size of the bride, until Hesper Coyle fixed him with a look sharp enough that he cleared his throat and got on with the business at hand. Augusta wore the dark blue dress she'd let out at the shoulders herself, the same careful stitching she'd done for every dress she'd ever owned, because there had never once been a dressmaker in 3 counties who kept fabric wide enough on the bolt for her, and she had stopped waiting, years ago, for the world to arrive at her size, instead of the other way around. Grange said his vows plain, the way he said most things, no flourish in them, no performance, just a steady accounting of what he intended to do with the rest of his life, and who he intended to do it beside. Augusta said hers the same way. Neither of them cried, though Hesper cried enough for the both of them, loud and unashamed, dabbing at her eyes with an apron she'd forgotten to take off. At the small supper afterward, Hesper stood with a cup raised, and the whole gathering, Otis Farr and his wife Ambrose Tate, looking oddly proud for a man who'd once refused to file a claim, Sheriff Pruitt and his wife Sarah, Tom Renner and his family, Grace Farrow, quieted to listen. "I've kept a boarding house in this valley the better part of 20 years, Hesper said, voice rough. Watched a great many people come through my door looking for a room and a fresh start. Most of them, I forgot inside a season. She looked at Augusta, and something in her weathered face went soft in a way none of them had seen before. This one, I don't imagine I'll manage to forget. Not if I live to be 100. She raised the cup higher. To Augusta Redding, who never once let this valley decide what she was, before she'd had the chance to show it herself, and to Elias Grange, fool enough to keep showing up. The gathering laughed, warm and easy, and Augusta looked around at the small crowd assembled under Eleanor Merrow's apple trees. People who had, in one way or another, all decided to stand beside her when standing must beside her cost them something, and felt the particular fullness of a heart that had spent a long time learning not to expect this much room to be offered to it at all. Word came from the prosecutor's office in early October that Cyrus Thorne had accepted the terms Augusta offered. The Renner claim, restored in full, water rights and all, by the middle of the month. The Farrow claim not far behind it, Grace Farrow standing in her own yard again, for the first time in 3 years, her late husband's fence line finally repaired by hands that had no obligation to repair it, beyond the plain decision to do so. Thorne himself pled guilty to the reduced charge that winter and left the territory before the first hard frost, and Larkspur Hollow, in the particular efficient way small towns have of closing over an absence, simply stopped mentioning his name within a season, the way a field forgets, eventually, that a fence post ever stood in a certain spot, once the ground around it has healed over. The harvest that year was the best the valley had seen in longer than anyone could remember, and Augusta found herself, in the weeks after, doing something she hadn't quite planned, but couldn't stop once she'd started. Sharing it. The smokehouse ran full through October, and what it produced went further than her own table. Grace Farrow took a share of cured meat and a week of Augusta's time helping restring that repaired fence line properly, post by post, the way it deserved to be strung. Tom Renner's family took seed corn on credit, to be repaid at harvest, no interest asked, and slowly, through that autumn, others began finding their way up the lane. Not just women working land alone, though there were several of those. A young man from the eastern draw, whose hands shook too badly for most farm work, but who turned out to have a gift for grafting fruit trees. Nobody else in the valley could match, and who Augusta put in charge of the orchard before the first snow, because talent, she'd decided, mattered a great deal more than steadiness of hand. An older widow, named Constance Abel, who'd been quietly refused credit at 3 different stores, because a rumor, years old and never true, had followed her from her last town, and who found, at the Redding place, that nobody asked her to explain herself before they'd let her prove herself instead. A young man, tall and rangy, born with one leg shorter than the other, who'd spent his whole life being told, plainly or otherwise, exactly what he couldn't do, and who Augusta watched, that first week, outwork 2 able-bodied hired men without once being asked to. Constance Abel arrived on a cold morning in November, standing at the edge of the yard with a single trunk and the particular careful stillness of a woman who had learned to expect the worst before she let herself hope for anything better. Augusta recognized the stillness immediately, had worn it herself once, standing in a different yard entirely. I heard you don't ask people to explain themselves before you'll give them a chance to prove otherwise, Constance said, by way of introduction. I heard right, whoever told you that. Augusta studied her a moment. What is it you do? Kept books for my late husband's store 12 years. Kept them well, whatever the town decided to say about me afterward. Constance's chin lifted, just slightly, bracing for the question that usually followed. I don't imagine you have much need of a bookkeeper on a farmstead. I've got a cooperative that's outgrown my own arithmetic 3 times over this season alone, Augusta said, and a stack of ledgers I've been meaning to sort since August that I keep finding excuses to avoid. She nodded toward the house. There's a room off the kitchen that stays warm through winter. It's yours if the work suits you. Constance stood very still a moment longer, the particular stillness of someone recalibrating what the world was allowed to offer her. Just like that, she said. Just like that, Augusta agreed. I found the explaining rarely tells you as much about a person as watching them work does. Figured I'd save us both the time. Constance picked up her trunk herself, before Augusta could reach for it, the small, fierce pride of a woman who had spent a long while being underestimated and had no intention of starting her new situation by being carried. She looked at each of them, standing in her yard the way she herself had once stood in a stranger's doorway, with nothing but a bag and a bone-handled knife. And she understood something she hadn't fully understood even the day she read Eleanor Merrow's letter for the first time. The letter hadn't only been about land. It had been about who gets to belong somewhere, who gets told, plainly, by someone who has no reason to lie about it, that they are capable, that they are welcome, that the size or shape or particular strangeness of them is not a footnote to explain before the real conversation starts. It was the whole conversation. It had always been the whole conversation. Most people had simply never bothered to have it properly. She stood at the edge of the orchard on a cold October evening, watching the last of the harvest come in. Elias beside her the way he was, beside her most evenings now, quiet, steady, unhurried. "You ever think," he said, "about what Eleanor Merrow would make of all this, if she could see it?" Augusta considered the question the way she considered most things, slow, turning it over fully before she answered. "I think she already knew," she said finally. That's what the letter was, really. Not a gift. A bet. She bet that whoever finally opened that door would be someone who understood what it cost to be looked at twice before anyone bothered learning your name. And she bet that person would do something with the understanding besides. Feel sorry for themselves over it. She bet on you. She bet on whoever came next. She just happened to be right that it turned out to be me. Grange was quiet a moment, watching the light move gold and long across the rows of trees Eleanor had planted and never lived to see grown fully into themselves. "Do something lasting," he said. "That's what the letter said, wasn't it? At the end. Make sure it matters," Augusta finished. She looked out at her land, hers, finally on paper, and in fact and in every sense that had ever mattered to her. The barn rebuilt stronger than the fire had left it, the smokehouse running steady, the orchard heavy with fruit, and scattered through the yard the particular, hard-won noise of people who had all, in their own way, once been told they didn't quite belong anywhere, finding out together that they did. The people of Larkspur Hollow had already stopped calling it the Marrow Place by then. They called it Redding Land. They called it the farm where you went if the rest of the world had already decided what it thought of you before you'd said a single word, because the woman who ran it had spent her whole life having that exact thing done to her and had built, out of 18 years of somebody else's patient hope, a place where it finally, plainly, stopped happening. "It matters," Augusta said quietly, watching the last light settle gold over land that was at long last entirely her own. "I made sure of it." The end.